Okay, I think we can get started. People will join halfway through, um, if they want.
Okay, sounds good. We have Miles here as well. He works with me at Minware. And today we're going to be talking about what every CEO needs to know about software development planning, aka how to make sure that your projects don't blow up and bankrupt your company. So my background's technical, computer science, software development, and I was technical co-founder at Collage.com, which is a bootstrap startup that I worked at for several years and grew to 86 million in revenue before selling to private equity. And we were a pretty small and lean team, and were forced to get a lot more done with limited resources. And during the process of doing this and having to be forced to be efficient, I learned a lot about just how inefficient other companies were, seeing our competitors who had 100 plus person engineering teams who weren't able to move as quickly. And based on that experience after leaving and selling the company, wanted to share some of the things I learned because it is kind of crazy how much development effort goes to waste and how much money companies throw out due to some mistakes that really are pretty common and not too difficult to avoid. So for a lot of CEOs, they don't really get involved in the details of engineering, and they rely on some sort of engineering leader, and they hear about a roadmap and allocate resources and pay people's paychecks. And ideally, the software comes out, but sometimes it just doesn't. And projects fail. And this is a pretty bad situation if you're a bootstrap company. Larger companies can afford to fail at engineering more often. When my company sold to previous company sold to a buyer, we were merged with another company that was about the same size, who'd been struggling, and they brought on a CEO who was a professional manager, and I was put in charge of the combined engineering team. And the first thing the CEO said to me was that there's this project that was supposed to take 3 months, and 80% of the entire engineering team has been working on it for the past year and it's not done. And I have no idea why. And this, like, if you're trying to bootstrap a company and it's your own money, like, this is insane. Apparently, he thought it wasn't that big of a deal, not a big enough deal for him to actually figure out what was going on before they acquired us and changed things around. But actually, the company after we sold it went bankrupt shortly thereafter. So maybe even private equity also can't afford to throw away an entire year of 80% of their company's engineering time. So what this talks about is how people who are business leaders should expect to have visibility into what's going on with engineering and why these projects fail, and what to expect to prevent this from happening to you. Liam was telling me a story about how he's seen sometimes people work on projects for months only to have them just get completely canned, and you can't do that if you have limited runway. It's more of a life or death situation for you there. So this might seem kind of obvious stated this way, but the number one reason that projects fail is they're not planned well. And in my personal experience for software development projects, the number one reason that the plans fail is that they're just too big. There's lots of other reasons. Maybe they weren't reviewed carefully. Maybe there are too many risks or whatever. But the biggest factor is just size. And one of the common ways that people try to address this is with Scrum and Agile. And going back to that that story about the team I inherited being 9 months behind on a 3-month project. They were following Scrum by the book. They had all of their tickets estimated and would always talk about how mature of a team they were and how well they followed Scrum practices. Unfortunately, the problem with this and with doing these fixed length iterations is, yes, the iteration is small, but that doesn't mean your initiative or project is small. If your project takes a year, then you're not agile, and the sprints aren't really going to fix that. At the same time, the sprint iteration is pretty big, and if you do all of your code changes for an entire 2-week period in one big ticket and release, that's also bad and is likely to cause problems. And another thing is that bugs get filed after projects go out. And so you're not necessarily going to see, if you're just focusing on Scrum development practices, whether there are quality issues, because the bugs get filed as new tickets. And so that's just, more points to complete toward the next sprint, and quality issues can often go undetected. So the most important thing to understand about projects being small is there's different sizes of, there's different levels of work batches that have different sizes, and they all need to be small. And if any of them get bigger than they should be, and you're batching too much together, you're going to increase your risk of failure and increase the impacts if something does fail. So starting from the bottom, first is the unit of work that gets deployed into the software in production, sometimes in staging, but ideally in a production environment. And without something being deployed, you don't know how it might break stuff. And so if you're doing something and it hasn't been deployed yet, then it's not going to be done from a code perspective because you haven't really verified that it's going to totally work. So that's the first level, is just, is it able to run with the other software? The next level is whether it's actually exposed to a user. Sometimes this is the same thing, but oftentimes you might deploy some code and then it's not really live because the full user interface isn't hooked up to it. So people haven't had the opportunity to break it. And a feature isn't really done until people are actually using it and you have the feedback about whether it works. And then the higher level above that is whether customers are getting value, whether customers are solving problems. And with the example of the 1-year project, that the big issue is that there was no value realized until the end, the way that it had been planned. And so if you work on it for 6 months and you stop, you have nothing. And this means that they weren't really doing agile, they were doing waterfall, because this whole value realization cycle was, well, it was supposed to be 3 months, but it was a year. And that's waterfall essentially. So it's also important to keep in mind the size of the work batch that needs to be complete to actually create value for the organization. And if you've done multiple sprints and you aren't at that point, then that's you're not done. And if you stop the project at that point, you wouldn't get the value out of it. So that's what's important to keep in mind when thinking about work batches. And good planning should minimize all of these. A little bit about that. So first on the epic or project or value level front. And epic is just Jira named for a type of container ticket that has multiple other tickets. The way to manage this is to group individual features and changes that are in tickets together by what has to be completed to solve a problem for the customer to create value. And it should be the smallest size that can create value for the customers. So you're not unnecessarily bundling together multiple solutions. However, once it's done, you should be able to validate that it's solving the problem and not just say, oh, well, this is, part 1, 2, 3, 4, are just going to split this into different epics. But if you stop after part 3, there's no value. So it's important to get those boundaries right, but also make it as small as possible so you aren't making that highest level work batch larger than you need to and increasing your risk. So one of the tips for this is if you do have a larger initiative, sometimes there are bigger things you're trying to accomplish that do solve multiple problems. You can split this up into individual milestones so that you can have a checkpoint after each one and stop and still have something to show for it if you don't proceed with the project. But it's not enough for the project itself to be small. If you do that, the individual tickets also have to be small. Otherwise, that's going to create other risks. And ideally, the work for a ticket should be launched into production as part of that ticket, possibly multiple times. But what you don't want is you don't want 5 different tickets saying, do this part, do this part, do this part, do this part, and then it just is part of one pull request that gets merged and launched. That's not really separate tickets. That's kind of just separate tasks. And you can use a checklist or something inside of the ticket if you want to do that. But the ticket should represent work that can be touched by the customer, and it's not done until customers have had the opportunity to try it out and break it, because that can create more work later if your tickets are below that level. And ideally, you want the feature to be live in production. Sometimes people have it live in a preview environment. That is kind of like halfway in between, where maybe you or somebody representing a customer can try it out, and that's okay. But when you're doing that type of development process, you do create additional risk that when it does go to production, people are going to find a lot more issues, and you have to go back and the true size of these tickets and epics will be larger. And then at the lowest level, people can run into trouble when their launches are too big. Ideally, you want to use continuous integration, continuous deployment, CI/CD. If you have a SaaS product on a website, you should be able to do this where you automatically launch code as it's merged into the main branch. If you're doing an app store release cycle, you might not be able to do this. But what you want to avoid is, hey, I did all this work and it's all marked done, but it's not in production. And then when you go to put it into production, and let's say you've been working on it for a month, and then it goes live and tons of stuff goes wrong, and you have to spend an entire week just fixing it because there were performance problems you didn't anticipate, or merge conflicts with other things, or whatever. So it's also important to keep in mind how much stuff is not in production yet and the risk that this creates by making those batches large. So those are some problems that people run into. And now we're going to talk a little bit about a planning process that can help you mitigate these problems. So you have to start from higher level ideas, and you can't possibly just be brainstorming and have all of the tickets and pull requests defined already. And you have to create these things incrementally and commit incrementally. So usually what people do to start with is think about what problems they want to solve for customers, think about what those solutions might look like, and have a discussion for roadmap planning where the ideas are pretty high level. The scope isn't necessarily fully defined, but you're just trying to have a discussion about the priorities. And at this point, it's okay not to have individual tickets for things and not have the scope fully defined. And people will often have some sort of initial roadmap estimate that's tied to an epic, whether they create one huge to-do ticket underneath it or just add story points to the epic itself. You need something that's a back of the envelope estimate for your project. But don't do this without getting input from engineers. That project that really blew up that I was talking about, what happened originally is that the product manager just decided that he thought he wanted it to take 3 months and just wrote that down. He didn't ask engineers how long it would actually take. He just came up with that number on his own and just told it to the CEO and the board, and they're like, great, yeah, let's do this. Don't do that. Definitely have engineers provide an estimate, and don't put pressure on them to make the estimate lower unless you want to substantially reduce the scope. This is a trap people fall into as well, especially if it's like a CEO and then you're talking to outsourced development who maybe has an incentive to be the yes man of sorts. You really want to get an unbiased opinion, because if you ask them to create more optimistic, rough back of the envelope estimates, they'll happily do that, but that doesn't mean that the software is going to get built any faster. So that's something that is important to keep in mind at this stage. And of course, if you're in a small bootstrap company, the CEO should be reviewing and approving the main roadmap expenditures. Now, the next thing that I've done in the past and that you should really do, that a lot of people don't do, is technical planning. So it was funny having a conversation with the person who is VP of engineering at this company I came into. We were talking about technical planning and talking about how, okay, when you're starting on a project or epic or whatever, you should outline what all of the individual tasks are going to be in that project. And he was sort of religiously opposed to doing this because he was an agile purist or whatever. And he was so upset about it that during a meeting that I had with him, he told me, well, you guys may do this at your company, but while you'd be spending your time doing that, then we'd just be building software. I didn't call him out on the fact that his team hadn't shipped anything in a year, but this is definitely something that people overlook in a lot of cases. But what you want to do is you want to break down the work into specific steps. And you can think about the classic, how do you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich question, right? A poor technical plan for that would be get the peanut butter and jelly and bread and make a sandwich, right? A better one would be, take an inventory of the peanut butter and the jelly that you have, see if there's enough to make a sandwich. Make sure you know when the deadline for having the sandwich is going to be. Look up how far away the store is, if you're out of any of the ingredients, how long it'll take to get there, if that's going to satisfy the deadline. If you can't make it to the store on time and back and make the sandwich, is it better to be late or is it better to just make a peanut butter sandwich? And there's a lot of detail that goes into something like that if you really think about it. And when you have that, like, oh yeah, just make the sandwich type of plan, that's when things really blow up, as soon as you encounter an issue that you didn't anticipate. So one of the things about doing this that people often don't understand too is that you want to complete this plan before you start implementation, but that doesn't mean that you do absolutely no coding at this stage. You can do coding to validate a technical idea or eliminate a technical risk by building a small prototype. If you're not sure if your database is going to handle the load that you need, then you can run a load test on the database, writing some code. Or if you're not sure if two libraries are going to be compatible with one another, you can create a small prototype that loads both of them and does something simple. And this is okay, and this is good, but you shouldn't start on the actual implementation because then you are just doing the project. And at the end of this, you should have tickets that are small. Large tickets, like I mentioned with the sandwich example, are red flag. Oftentimes, I've seen less experienced engineers create tickets that are just larger, and you might have something that, let's say, is estimated at 5 points or a week. It's like, okay, well, what do you specifically have to do to accomplish that? And you start listing out more and more and more stuff. Actually, this is going to take 3 weeks. So this is something to look out for, and is a classic reason why software estimation goes wrong. So as CEO of a small company where every dollar matters, you should look at these plans, and you may not understand the technical details, but you should at least validate that they have details and that those details are sufficiently small so that you at least know the people who do have the knowledge have really thought carefully about it, and put effort into the planning step. So this is the most important thing that a lot of people skip or don't do. And like that team that ran over by 9 months, what they were doing is each sprint, they would just say, oh, okay, well, the next thing we have to do is this API. Okay, now let's do the planning for this API at the beginning of the sprint. And they do that, and like, oh, look, this is going to take us 2 weeks. Then they do the next thing, like, oh, I guess this is going to take us 1 week or 4 weeks or whatever. But they were not really discovering how big the project truly was until they did each part, each sprint, and then just went on and on and on. And it's like, oh, well, it's almost done, it's almost done, it's almost done. And it's just kept happening. And this is the part where people might complain about the creating tickets in advance, like this isn't agile. It's like, well, it's also not agile to have a project that doesn't deliver value that's spanning multiple sprints. But if you do, then you should know how big it is, right? And starting on an open-ended epic or project where you haven't defined the tickets and the tasks you need to do at a low level is the riskiest thing. It's basically like saying, well, we have an idea of the value of this, but we have no idea how much it's going to cost. But let's just do it and find out. And this is the risky thing, and the part where people often don't understand what agile really means, and will be resistant to doing this type of planning. And then during implementation, you want to track the work and make sure it's on track. And the role of a business owner at this point is looking at how much work has been getting done in each, if you're using sprint, every sprint, or if you're not doing sprints every week or 2 weeks, make sure there's progress being made on the project. And then also look at how many new tickets had to be added to the project because they were missed during the initial planning. And you can see these numbers and extrapolate them and see if they make sense, and see if they align with the original plan, and use this regular review to spot problems. So these are the steps you can follow to dramatically reduce the risk of stuff blowing up and wasting lots of time and money. And there's specific things that you can do to hold teams accountable without micromanaging them, and things that are reasonable to expect from an engineering leader, or whether it's somebody who works for you directly, or a co-founder, or somebody you're outsourcing to. These are things that if your engineering leader says that you shouldn't be doing them, or it's not fair, or this is micromanaging, that's not true. These are all things that are totally reasonable that I would expect as an engineering leader. So first, you need to do your work in systems that are trackable, and you need to use GitHub or something for version control. You need to use pull requests, not just be committing stuff to the master branch. And you need to use some sort of tickets for your work in a system. I mean, technically you could do it on paper, but everyone's over the internet, so you shouldn't do that. And the code changes should be linked to the tickets. Standard best practice, put the identifier of the ticket in the branch name. It'll be linked so you can see what code is associated with that. And then all tickets that are part of a project where the ticket itself doesn't have the customer solution, but is part of a larger group of tickets that need to be done together to create value for the customer, then they should be in a container that you can tell they're part of the same thing, whether you're actually using Jira and putting them in an epic or doing some sort of label in another system. And then this is important. Every ticket should have an estimate. There's no excuse for not doing this. If you don't have an estimate, whether it's story points or hours or whatever you want to do, there's no estimate on a ticket. That means that you have no idea when it's going to be done, and it's impossible to be held accountable for it. Just put, if it's trivially small, put 0. If it's big, put 20 or whatever. But if you don't put anything, then it's really impossible to tell how large things are supposed to be. And these are all really easy things to do, and there's no valid reason not to do them almost all the time. I mean, you're going to make mistakes every now and then, or do some 5-minute thing that doesn't have a ticket or whatever. But really, we see in people who use Minware that people are able to do this 95% of the time. So with that in place, the next thing to do is to look at projects on an individual basis at different checkpoints. So obviously you're going to want to look at the roadmap to see what people are deciding to pursue further and approve that. But also it's important to look at projects after the technical plan has been completed, because until that technical plan is complete, you don't know how much that project will cost. You think you have an approximate idea, but you don't really know. And committing to things without knowing how much they're going to cost is a bad idea for bootstrap companies. And then while the project is going on, what you can do is just take a look at the end of each sprint. So you're not meddling, you're not randomly asking people questions in the middle of the work that they're doing. There's an agreement, okay, every 2 weeks, we're going to look at how the project is going, and if progress isn't being made, or if there's too much scope increase, we're going to look and make sure that the project should proceed and not be canceled. And if you have these well-defined checkpoints, everyone's on the same page. The CEO can be sure that the project isn't going to blow up unexpectedly and reduce the risk if it does. And then other people know when their work is going to be looked at and don't have to be afraid of having the CEO randomly show up and being like, how's this project going, in the middle of what they're doing. Then the next thing that you should look at, some core metrics that will give you a sense of what your overall efficiency is in a retrospective sense. So the first thing is these batch sizes. How big is each pull request, each ticket, each epic? There's different ways to do this depending on how you have your system set up. You could just look at the estimated story points if you think those are relatively accurate. If they're not, then you might want to ask people how long they spent. Sometimes people will say, oh, fill out actual story points. Some people do time logs. With Minware, we compute it automatically based on commit history and ticket activity. So there are a number of ways to do this, but essentially you want to look at the tickets and epics and pull requests and see the distribution of their sizes. And I've got a leaf blower going on right outside my window right now. They haven't come. The landscapers haven't come in 3 weeks because it's the fall, but they come right now. But yeah, when you're looking at this too, and in general, when you're looking at metrics, I always recommend not just looking at the average. I hate averages. Averages can be very misleading. You should look at the median, and you should also look at the largest projects because you can be doing great. Your median average can be pretty good, but you can have one massive project that if unless you actually sort them and look at the biggest ones, you might not observe that. So that's the first thing to look at. And then another important metric is how many bugs are you creating and how many of them are being fixed. This gives you protection against the scenario where, yeah, your work batches are nice and small, except they're really not because you have to go back and fix them later because when they are put into production, they're buggy and don't work and you don't realize the full value and you have to do more work later that's not directly linked to them to actually complete those things. So new bug rate will let you know if there are issues with quality. Looking at it in aggregate can help you identify deeper problems with how much the team's investing in test automation and fixing technical debt, which is also important. A lot of times, this can particularly be a problem when you're outsourcing development too, because they have less of a vested interest in code quality. But yeah, if you neglect these things, then the bug rate can get worse and worse and worse over time and really impede project delivery in a way that's harder to notice. And then a few other metrics that are helpful to look at, auditing some of the work items. Are people just splitting up epics into smaller groups, even though that group isn't delivering value or fully solving a problem for the customer? They're just kind of, doing that. Which again, if you're outsourcing and you give people instructions about metrics, that's where we've seen the most sort of gaming of, oh yeah, I'll make my epic small here. I just split this one in half. Or same thing with tickets. So this is important to take a look at as well. And then you really want to know for mitigating the issue of larger code batch sizes, how much code are you sitting on in terms of work days that is done but not actually live in production? And there are some ways to calculate this. You can look at deployment frequency, which might be okay if you also look at pull request sizes. It might be sufficient to just look at your practices for continuous integration, continuous deployment. If you have it set up to automatically deploy every merge to main and that's working, then that might be okay. Another thing that you might need or want to do is you can actually not mark the ticket done in your ticketing system until it's really live. And this is helpful if you're doing feature flags. So if you launch code and it's technically on your production website or whatever, but it's inaccessible to customers because you have it blocked with a feature flag, then it's really important to make sure you are tracking that. Because as soon as you turn that feature flag on, people are going to start finding bugs, and then you have to go back and fix that thing. So that is it in a nutshell. And the last thing I wanted to mention here is that if you think you might be too small, you're not. When I was working at my former company, Collage.com, we threw away months of developer time on stuff that just failed to get done on time when we had several people and wasted just orders of magnitude more time than it would have taken us to do the planning. And now starting Minware as a brand new company, I did technical planning when I was working by myself to just outline what are the steps going to be in this project, what are the risks, to identify those things and to have a more realistic cost estimate so I could decide whether to do it or not. And as soon as there was a second person, I was doing all of these things. So it can really help you no matter how small you are, and doesn't take that much work to do by hand, but also Minware is free. And if you're less than 5 people, you can sign up and it'll automatically do a lot of stuff, like tell you exactly how many days went into each pull request. So you don't have to kind of go back and look at it. It'll just do that for you automatically. So there's no excuse. All right. That covers it here. Happy to answer any questions or dive deeper in any of these areas you guys want to hear more about.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. I do have some questions, but Casey, do you have any questions you want to ask before I go?
You can go ahead.
Sweet. Okay, so in the technical planning phase, because this is kind of something I'm going through at the moment personally. So this was interesting because currently, yeah, I bundle everything into so like kind of do the plan and then straight to implementation. And I like this as a step before that. How do you have any like frameworks or sets of questions to assess for risks? Because sometimes you don't know what you don't know, right? Like
Yeah,
you don't know what could go wrong. And
yeah.
is there any like heuristic just to kind of get the juices flowing about what risks there potentially might be?
Yeah, this is going to be specific to your organization and depend on the type of software that you develop. But at Collage.com previously, we had a list of like 10 questions, and we would review these questions for every project to just make sure that we've thought of everything. And it would cover things like, are there going to be performance implications of this once thousands of users are hitting this feature? Is this going to potentially cause issues with our caching layers and our content distribution network and the pre-rendering we do for our pages? Is that going to be a problem? We didn't have this at my former company, but we might have a question about legal or compliance risks, or are there going to be any security risks, or and a really important one is backwards compatibility. If you're changing your API, is the change backwards compatible? If it's not backwards compatible, how are you going to migrate existing customers so that their data will get updated? What I recommend for people is to have the senior engineers list out the types of things that have caused problems in the past for projects, and have a template for technical planning for your organization that lists these questions so that you ensure people think about them and don't overlook these things for their projects.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, completely understand it's like nuanced to relevant to the business. Yeah. Um, so this was kind of related to the question one of the founders had was like, I think his question was related to how can like any sort of frameworks or structures for tickets to ensure that like the engineer has a clear picture like of what's to be done. Like just any sort of rough structure to ensure that, you know, all bases are covered. There's no like missing context.
Yeah, again, this might vary depending on the type of ticket, what it's for. In general, it's important to have clear acceptance criteria. That's the one thing that's common regardless of what type of development you're doing. The acceptance criteria should state what it means for that ticket to be done in what the person who filed the ticket is going to expect once that ticket is actually done. And it's important to write this down explicitly when you have a conversation as well. I've been in a lot of scenarios where there's a conversation and you think you understand what the acceptance criteria is, but there isn't a mutual understanding. So it can be helpful for the person if somebody's creating a ticket like a product manager and somebody's implementing it like a developer, it can be helpful if they're having a conversation for the product manager to ask the developer to write down what they think the acceptance criteria is to make sure that it matches your understanding, because that's what you're going to get. But yeah, that is the key, is to include that. Oftentimes people just put like acceptance criteria : and have it be an explicit thing they require in every ticket. But the important thing is that there's a mutual understanding of what that is between the product manager and developer.
Well, yeah, I guess if you do the technical planning effectively, then the what needs to be done for each ticket should be a lot clearer. I guess tickets being unclear and like scope being unclear is probably a symptom of not doing enough planning. So I think it's important to remember that. Um, I'll pause there. Casey, do you have any you want to ask? Because I don't want to hog all the time here.
Yeah, you're okay. I just have one, and it's a little weird because my situation like varies a little bit. So I do all of the engineering, so like I don't have a team that I'm kind of communicating with, but doing everything myself, I guess something I struggle with sometimes is there's multiple projects or like things that I want to accomplish, but I don't have really a way of measuring like how important they are or which one I should be doing. So is there like a process you go through to determine what projects should be like completed first, or like, weigh it in terms of
Yeah.
importance?
The way that I try to think about it, which goes a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, but as far as the evaluation of different projects, I try to think about whether a project first is actually kind of like a bug fix in a general sense. Is it something that needs to be done to enable customers to get value out of other things you've already done? Is it something that if the customer encounters it, they're going to feel like it's a deficiency or something missing in your product, versus like a value add type of thing? And to try to get all of those meaningful deficiencies prioritized before new functionality, in addition to things that are explicitly bugs. And this ensures that you are getting the full value out of the things that you've already done, but it also means you have less hanging over your head. Because if you have, let's say, one project that enables, let's say, more types of users to access a feature or whatever, and they can't right now. Until you do that, the lack of that functionality is going to be hanging over your head and will always exist. If you're talking about a totally new feature, if you don't do that feature, it's not hanging over your head. It's not a deficiency. So you actually, whether or not you write it down, you effectively have a backlog of these things that are like impediments to realizing full value. And when you have a lot of those things, it creates a lot of overhead of thinking about what to do next, makes planning more difficult, hurts customers. So I really try to emphasize like quality fixes, not just immediate defects, but quality in the general sense fixes before new things. Now, if nobody's using your product and you need to, pivot and do something else, but not worry about the quality of the stuff you've already built, then that's different, and it kind of depends where you are. But if a lot of people are using your product and you're focused on scaling that, and not at that early prototype value discovery phase, then you're going to make life a lot easier for yourself by tackling these defects. And that's why at Collage.com, with nearly $100 million in revenue, we only had 15 engineers, and of those engineers, maybe 2 were required to really keep the lights on if we wanted to not develop new stuff. And that's really small for a company that size, because we would always be prioritizing these things that are going to cause customer support calls, cause emergencies, disrupt us, prevent us from doing other things. So that's one tip for prioritizing. But other than that, yeah, it is going to be dependent on your situation as well.
Okay, thank you, Kevin.
Sure.
Cool. We're at time there, so I want to respect your time. Because I know we only agreed 45 minutes. So thank you so much. I didn't get the link to the slides. I think you said you shared them. Maybe you shared them somewhere else.
Did I put them in the chat?
You might. It says 2, and then there's like a
to
drop
AI
down
meeting
yeah.
notes. Meeting group chat. Okay.
Yeah. Got
There
it.
you go. Yeah, so you can access the slides there.
Awesome. And you said Minware free for up to 5 seats, it sounds like.
Free for up to 5 active developers. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think everyone fits under that. Cool. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. Really useful, especially for me, like from a non-technical perspective. I'll share this recording with everyone as well, and tell them about Minware. Unless there was anything else you wanted to cover, I guess we could leave it there.
Nope, I think that's good. And yeah, please share the recording with me as well.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much, guys.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.